the problem with base building, the problem with rank and file strategy, even when it's not about the Democratic Party, it is about the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, the idea is, well, we need a new party because the Democrats aren't good enough.
Mm-hmm.
Or we need to shore up the base of the Democratic Party. And in so doing, maybe we'll change the Democratic Party.
Welcome to the Cutrone Zone again. With me today, as always, is the last Marxist, everyone's favorite track coach, resident genius, Chris Cutrone. Chris, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Doug.
Yeah. Today we're going to talk about sublation and dialectics, but through the context of your essay in the Marxism and Politics book, which is called Against Dogmatic Abstraction.
Mm-hmm.
That piece is about understanding the split between anarchism and Marxism,
Mm-hmm.
How you make a case for Marxism being an advance beyond anarchism. When I was younger, much younger, just starting out on the left,
Mm-hmm.
I knew some people who were socialists who were trots, part of socialist action. And I was the anarchist that would show up. And one of my friends said, well, he's our conscience. He's supposed to be, he's the ultra leftist here. And the socialist action people would always say, he's conservative. No, he is not. He is not to our left. But I guess the question I have for you is, how do you understand the difference between anarchism and Marxism in terms of dialectics, or this sort of the Hegelian core of Marxism?
Right. So, of course, anarchism predates Marxism.
Right.
And anarchism is part of the greater socialist or communist movement of the 19th century that Marx had as his critical object. Now, interestingly enough, and I know that you've talked with Spencer Leonard about this, Proudhon, who is the father of anarchism, considered himself a follower of Hegel. And in that respect, Marx engaged a critique of Proudhon that was similar to and combined Marx's critique of the young Hegelians and also of the sort of more radical bourgeois political economy of the early 19th century, and other tendencies in socialism and communism that predated Proudhon. So, Marx sees in Proudhon like the birth of proletarian socialism as opposed to bourgeois socialism. And that's less of a class sociological characterization than it is a historical characterization, meaning Proudhon for Marx was the most up-to-date expression of socialism and communism in his time. And that's why he really kind of disciplined himself around the critique of Proudhon. Now, that being the case, of course, Marx did what he usually does, is, he did basically accuse Proudhon of failing to be as dialectical as Hegel and as bourgeois political economy itself was. So, this is a theme of mine, kind of pedagogically. But I also think that it gets to the heart of the matter, the substance, that Marxism is based on the critique of socialism or communism. And that socialism and communism are seen as an expression of capitalism, as an ideology of capitalism, as riven with the same self-contradictions in subjective ideology and political practice, subjective both theoretically and practically, as capitalism is objectively in social reality. So it's the subjective and the objective, right? So
let me just ask
Go ahead.
A clarifying question. So one of the ways in which I understand Marx to be critiquing anarchists like Proudhon is that he is pointing out that they tend to, and tell me if I'm wrong here, but that they tend to remain at the level of subjectivity, on the level of individual consciousness, perhaps, more than they ought to, and rather than looking to the way in which social cooperation is structured by, say, labor time or
Right. There are many ways of thinking about this problem, right? Which is that, on the one hand, of course, Marxists consider pre-Marxian socialism to be backward, meaning a phenomenon of a historical lag in consciousness. That it's, in that sense, again, what I mentioned earlier about bourgeois and proletarian being historical rather than sociological categories. So, ironically enough, even though Marx considered Proudhon to be the first sort of clear expression of proletarian socialism as an ideology, he also, at the same time, considered Proudhon to be a petty bourgeois socialist. Now, what does that mean? It means that the discontents of the working class in capitalism are petty bourgeois in nature, meaning there's the haute bourgeois and there's the petit bourgeois. There's the sort of top dog bourgeois and there's the lower subordinate bourgeois. And the workers are the lower stratum of bourgeois society, as opposed to the capitalists, who are the higher stratum of bourgeois society. So the workers, in their trade union consciousness, to use a term from Kautsky and Lenin and Luxemburg, are petty bourgeois. Collective bargaining is petty bourgeois. Right. This is the tricky part, because otherwise we might get into, a lot of confusion right off the bat. And what Marx said about Proudhon, and in this way he's critical of Proudhon, but also defends Proudhon, that Proudhon's sort of individualistic critique is the complement of a more collectivistic critique, which Marx and Engels didn't want to throw in with either. They said, we're against the barracks socialism of the collectivists, but we're also against this petty bourgeois individualistic socialism and communism of Proudhon and others, but basically what we associate with anarchism. So the Marxists will say, the anarchists are liberals and they're petty bourgeois and they're individualists and this and that. Well, we have to distinguish between a kind of like pejorative, like polemical characterization and an actual like analysis or dialectical critique.
Right.
Right?
Yes, right.
There's a big difference there. And one of the problems that we deal with Marxism is that there's a conflation of the propagandistic and the rhetorical and the actual theoretical and critical.
Right. Well, in my flat-footed way, when I would critique Proudhon, it would be on the basis of his economics, the way in which he thought you could overcome inequalities and contradictions in society through various fixes having to do with realizing labor value fairly rather than overcoming
through mutual cooperation of the working class. So there is this idea that the working class can defeat capitalism by withdrawing from the state and also by withdrawing from capitalist employment. So
being self-employed, everyone their own entrepreneur in a way, right?
In a way, but not so much at the individual personal, like individual human being level, but more at the level of, some workers get together and start a company rather than being hired by a capitalist.
Right. And
so the individual firm is also a category of individualism in capitalism.
To kind of the worker co-op,
worker co-op. And, and again, the issue is, look, society is both individual and collective in character. So it's about the relation of the individual and the collective. So we shouldn't naturalize or hypostasize or reify this antinomy or opposition between the individual and the collective. That's a phenomenon of capitalism that on a certain level just doesn't make sense. Capitalism is it's both and neither individual and collective authentically. It's rather individualistic and collectivistic in a one-sided and reified way, right? So capitalism is dominating us in a way that is both expressed through individualism and through collectivism. Both of those are basically oppressive phenomena or, aspects. And so again, it's kind of like, well, you have the collectivistic communists and you have the individualistic communists, aka anarchists.
Yeah.
Right. And it's kind of like, okay, well, what do you do with this phenomenon? The phenomenon of a proletarianized working class that is discontented with and trying to mount a social and political movement against capitalism, but that is divided between individualists and collectivists. What do you do with that? Right?
Mm-hmm.
So Marx and Engels are like, well, we have to encompass both and give in to neither.
Right. And so and to be really dialectical, when you start to realize he's not saying, oh, every human being is their own entrepreneur, but workers collectively can form firms and create businesses and practices that will break from the capitalist class, you realize that even for Proudhon, there's a collectivist or collective
absolutely
aspect,
of course there
right?
is.
And
whole anthropology.
Right. So it's not so much that he didn't have a view of the problem on the scale of the collective and thought everything was just a matter of their subjective attitude, but rather that from a Marxist perspective, his understanding and model of the collective reality was inadequate. Yeah.
In other words, but the other point would be that actually Proudhon's critique of capitalism is that it is kind of antisocial, individualistic, etc. That Proudhon, his critique of liberalism and a kind of liberal utilitarianism, he called it the philosophy of misery or the miserable philosophy. What is it? Thomas Carlyle called economics the dismal science. For the same reason, which is that you're kind of taking you're taking the kind of self-interested, selfish individual, and you're kind of taking your view of society from that perspective. And it's a miserable perspective, because what about the fact that we are always social and cooperating, etc.? I mean, that's Proudhon's point.
Right.
Right? And Marx is like, well, let's look at that. And it's not that he's saying that Proudhon, isn't really a collectivist or a cooperativist. He is. Obviously he is. But that even his critique of capitalism as individualistic is individualistic. That's the other twist of the dialectic. Right?
Say a little more about that. How so?
Well, because again, it's based on a notion of bourgeois social relations that, again, the notion is naturalized, it's anthropologized. Right? This is why you get anarcho-primitivism. That's why you get like David Graeber, The Dawn of Everything, right? It's like, okay, in what way are we like violating human nature? And we've been doing it for thousands of years. And it's like, come on. No, this is human nature. And it doesn't mean human nature is red in tooth and claw and that it's the war of all against all. You see, this whole notion, is human nature selfish or is it altruistic? This is all an ideological projection of the contradiction of capitalism.
What I recall is that Proudhon was very focused on currency and the question of silver and gold and trying to break away from the centralized banks and trying to develop.
Certainly Graeber is following Proudhon in treating money as the problem, but then the question is how is that, and how is that made possible? And then quickly you come to the state, right? That the state uses money as a technology for enslaving the people.
Right. Whereas when I read Capital and started my trek down into Marxism, I was taught that money is actually an expression of the true mediating structure in society,
Yeah.
which was labor time,
Yeah.
and that that no matter what you decided to use to represent money, whether it was gold or silver,
Exactly, or paper, it doesn't matter.
or paper,
right? Otherwise, you're going to
that
end up becoming a gold bug.
right. It would always end up with some of the same tendencies, which money would tend to concentrate. This power would concentrate along with it. Because
that's accumulation and centralization of capital. I mean, so here's, this is the other dialectical twist.
Mm-hmm.
Labor only attains to its concept in
Mm-hmm.
capitalism. And money only attains to its concept in capitalism.
Right. I know what the second one means. Explain the first. Money only attaining to its concept, from my way of thinking, means that money as the primary means to provide subsistence for the majority of people only truly arises through capitalist forms of production, and that
right, and we have to be careful what capitalism is, right? So again, the difference that I always maintain between bourgeois society and capitalism, because at another level, one would say, well, in fact, labor attains to its concept in bourgeois society, and money attains to its concept in bourgeois society, meaning starting in the Renaissance, you get a commercial society, etc. And that actually capitalism violates both the principle of labor and the principle of money. That's why there have been money crises ever since the Industrial Revolution, that Proudhon is picking up on, but again, kind of misattributing cause and effect, right? What's the effect and what's the cause? What's the nature of the evil? And I would say that attaining to its concept, this Hegelian notion, this bizarre dialectical notion, means that it's contradicting itself. When something attains to its concept, that means that it's achieved full self-contradiction and is in need of overcoming itself or sublating itself.
Right. And would you agree that when money is the means for self-subsistence for the majority of people on the planet, that at that moment money comes into contradiction with itself?
I don't think that it has to do with that. I think it has to do with the dynamics of history. Okay. Meaning a small population, relatively speaking, of the human race could become, completely mediated by a money economy. And the historical significance of that is far-reaching. So we don't have to wait until, it's kind of like we don't have to wait for the majority of humans to no longer be subsistence peasants, which only happened in our lifetime, Doug.
Yeah.
Right.
I know.
We don't have to wait for that for bourgeois society to be reality.
Okay.
Be the totality, in fact. And the reason that it's the totality is the driving dynamic of history to which everything is subject. It's the vortex into which everything is being drawn. And
I think the reason I wanted to say that was the moment was because it was the moment when money was totalitarian, when money completely dominated society. But there are societies within society, right? And now we have a global, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's like when Marx, is looking at England as his case in the 19th century, and yet there are still more domestic servants and individual farmers than there are factory workers.
Right.
Right? And that doesn't matter. It's not about human populations. It's about the dynamics of history. It's not about the majority of people. It's about what's driving society.
Right.
And, now, again, this is all very peculiar because when people think of totality, they think spatially, they think numerically, right? They don't think temporally. They don't think historically. And, we are living, we will always be waiting for capitalism to fully realize itself. And it will always seem that capitalism fully realized itself a long time ago and that we're no longer living in capitalism, but we're in some kind of post-capitalist hell from which there's no escape. Right? And that's that's the dialectical point as well, which is that how do we overcome a moving contradiction from within that contradiction and as part of that contradiction? There's no outside of it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's the other thing. When we think of contradiction, we think of either or. That's not Hegelian contradiction at all. Right? We think of like competing logics or something, you know, like this logic versus that logic contradict each other. No. Right? Otherwise, we're going to be in like, I don't know what, the economy versus the life world or something, you know?
Yeah.
Right? And it's like, no. That's not the point. Right?
Mm-hmm.
The point is that at no point is everything capitalist, and yet everything is capitalist.
Right. Yeah, because at no point is everything capitalist numerically or spatially, but from a very early period, capital dominated and drove our society and
Historical
our
development.
History. Yeah.
And so I think that's the hard part. And I think that, you know, to get back to the Milstein for a moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that there were two things that I noted in that article. One was the Marxism in theory, anarchist in practice formulation, right, which is common. It's not exclusive to her by any means. It's a common idea. The anarchists will say, they will all say, really, we have to give credit to Marx as a theorist, but not follow his political practice.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And now what's interesting is that, you know, the situation we're in now, so it's, you know, January 1st, 2025, and, you know, we're in a second Trump administration, and lo and behold, 10 years later, campaign for a socialist party. All right. What does it mean to be Marxist in theory and anarchist in practice? Because in many ways,
that's what we're doing, right?
That's what we're doing. That's exactly it, right?
Yeah.
And that's why I found Milstein interesting. Now, she was writing before Occupy. Before Occupy Wall Street, Zuccotti Park actually took place. However, she was already speaking in the context of the Occupy everything, you know, the sort of coming insurrection, you know, this kind of thing. And she was criticizing it for being like vanguardist, right? In that sense, elitist, you know, kind of voluntaristic. You know, so she was an anarchist who was putting the brakes on anarchism and invoking Marxism to do so. And I thought, okay, that's a great entry point for me to clarify, to use this to clarify what Marxism is and isn't. Right? And so, again, we have to be careful. It's not like Marx's critique of Proudhon or Marxism's critique of anarchism. It's just some kind of opposition to anarchism. Right? Because in that respect, you know, I've been thinking about this a lot because we're in this kind of neo-Stalinist kind of moment. Yeah. And, you know, the imminence of socialism to liberalism, right? From a Marxist perspective. And, you know, I think that, again, rhetorically, one could get very lost because when Marx criticizes socialists as liberals, you could think, oh, see, he's like owning the libs or something. And it's like, that's not the point. The point is that they're actually insufficiently liberal.
Right.
Because they're insufficiently self-consciously liberal.
Right.
They're not recognizing or acknowledging their imminence. Right, because anti-liberalism goes back, and in fact, liberalism is itself a kind of funny phenomenon of capitalism. That's why the anarchists, for example, will say that they respect classical liberalism, but not liberalism tout court, which is 19th century apologia for capitalism.
Right.
They like classical liberals, but they don't like liberalism, the kind of reification of liberalism. Or of liberal thought, or, you know, bourgeois emancipatory thought, or enlightenment, whatever you want to call it. You know, can I make a digression?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so my digression is this, and it's also an opportunity for me to clarify myself. So I watched two things of Zizek's. One was a short that popped up, and one was a 4-part dialogue with Yanis Varoufakis.
Are these old or brand new?
No, current. They're very recent, in fact. And the Varoufakis and Zizek, they landed on an important point which is that they agreed the left must be based on freedom, not justice.
Okay.
Right? And I thought, okay, my ideas are having an effect.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, I tell you what, yeah.
Now the other
it's weird. I think they are, by the way. I really do.
No, they do. No, people, Zizek has read me, of course. And Varoufakis, I'm not so sure, but probably. Because how could it not be the case after 20 years? But, it's in the air anyway. Let's just say it's in the air. And also, it's objectively true. So they didn't have to get it from me. They can discover it for themselves. It's just true. Now, the other one was the short by Zizek that I found rather unfortunate. And that points to this phenomenon of neo-Stalinism on the part of, ex-Zizekians, basically. We can just call them ex-Zizekians. We can say Haas, and we can say Daniel Tutt. We can say the people who are disenchanted with Zizek, that they think Zizek's a liberal. Okay.
Oh, no.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so, again, they would hear Varoufakis and Zizek say it's got to be freedom, not justice, and they would say, okay, these are liberals, or these are social democrats, they're liberals, whatever. And this is the source of their pro-imperialism or whatever. Especially in the case of Zizek, Varoufakis has the typical, anti-imperialism and wears it very proudly as a Greek or whatever. Now, the short by Zizek is... He starts off by saying, it's about Israel-Palestine. He starts off by saying, well, of course I agree that Hamas must be destroyed. But what Israel is doing goes far beyond that, and I don't understand what they're doing. They're generating anti-Semitism through their, genocidal violence against the Palestinians. And I thought, in fact, I know my hate watchers and my hostile audience and, my general, people who don't like me. I don't think that Hamas must be destroyed. I don't call for that. I don't. I just think they will be destroyed, meaning after October 7th, I just thought, okay, Hamas is done. And the act itself was a kind of confession of failure on their part. And it's not like I want it or demand it or, that whole, the whole framework, right? So this is where Zizek was kind of proving the point of the neo-Stalinists against him, is that he was sort of jumping on board with Hamas must be destroyed. And I think that Bernie Sanders said something similar, well, of course Hamas must be destroyed. And, early on when we were having our dialogue after October 7th, and I was just saying, this is it. This will be the end of Hamas and Israel will win this war and whatever. And then I got accused of Hasbara style, rhetoric, this objectivistic, this is just the case. And it's but wait, I'm not a spokesperson for the Israeli government, and I'm not saying this to demoralize people or to help bring it about or something. I just looked at the situation and I was like, yeah, they're done. And Hezbollah done. They're just done, right? And, do I want it? Do I regret it? Neither, because I have no control over it whatsoever. But also, getting rid of Hamas, it might produce something worse.
What I was just about to say is that I might be for the ending of Hamas or the destruction of Hamas if it meant that it would be overturned by a people's revolution and a socialist movement where more freedom, more work, more participation in the world was going to be the outcome. But if you are going to destroy Hamas by killing them all and in instituting some sort of military dictatorship from a foreign occupying power, you're not going to really end Hamas. You might end that version of Hamas, but some other version was very likely to come along, I think.
So in the Varoufakis-Zizek discussion, they also landed on this, on Israel-Palestine, which is that Israel needs Hamas.
Right.
And that, basically the idea that, I don't know, that Netanyahu let the attack happen because it served him politically and this kind of thing. And I'm just well, okay, let's just be careful about this. So I don't think the U.S. government wants Hamas destroyed.
No, they clearly didn't.
They don't.
Clearly did. Yeah, the Biden administration didn't.
Right.
And I don't think Trump does
Trump may
either.
not either. Exactly. Trump might not either. So the point being that, like, whether Netanyahu, wants Hamas to continue. I mean, the idea was, what Varoufakis said was, Netanyahu needs Hamas to prove to the Americans that a two-state solution is impossible. And I thought, well, that's one way of thinking about it, but it's like this funny intentionality and whatever, and that might even be true. Like, that might be Netanyahu's conscious, deliberate intent. Oh, fine. Now, whether that works, obviously the US has not given up on a two-state solution, and they're never going to give up on a two-state solution. It's not like Hamas will ever prove to the US that there shouldn't be a two-state solution. That will never happen.
Right.
Right? And so, anyway, but once you step outside the paranoid world of the left, like Varoufakis and Zizek, then you just think, okay, well, we need to be at least as realistic as the capitalist politicians.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Meaning it's neither here nor there. Meaning the struggle for socialism in the world, in the Middle East, in the United States, precedes whether or not Hamas exists. It really does. It precedes whether or not, like, Netanyahu is in power in Israel. The task is the same. And that's why I don't want Hamas to be destroyed. Because it's kind of neither here nor there strategically, from our perspective.
Right.
Right? So the only point is to not, again, engage in like ideological, like sophistic, like apologia for Hamas. And say, oh, well, they are the true national liberation force, and they are like the actual agency of this collective entity, the Palestinian people, whatever that might be.
Mm-hmm.
And that, like the Zionism thing, and it's like, there are no like innocent occupiers, like babies at the kibbutz are, still occupiers or whatever. Like this, no, we can't do any of that,
Mm-hmm.
And obviously the old-fashioned Marxist point would be, you can't erase class either from the Palestinian side or the Israeli side.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that works to a certain extent, but actually that's sort of stretching it, and it sort of, begs credulity. I mean, this is why people will attack us, you and I, Doug, and say,
Mm-hmm.
oh, you guys are waiting for this, like, Israel-Palestine collective, like, joint working class struggle. And ha ha ha, look at how foolish that is. And it's like, well, obviously we can't assume that.
Right. We're not waiting for it to just self-emerge spontaneously.
Exactly. Right. So Hamas is an enemy, and the Israeli government or state is an enemy only insofar as it becomes an enemy of the struggle for socialism.
Right.
Otherwise, it's just there. It's like, I don't know. You know what I mean? It's like a shark in the water.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to deal with it. Right? You
Mm-hmm.
neither provoke it, you don't, pretend it's something else, pretend it's not a shark. You don't pretend it doesn't exist. Ignore it.
Yeah.
Right? You deal with it. You can still go swimming even if there's a shark in the water. You can.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I don't know.
People do all the time. People do.
I've seen Jaws. They put that netting up.
They do, but that's because it was a shark that had already gotten the taste for human blood. Right? No, it is a little bit like that, right?
Yeah.
Because, and again, it's like, well, okay, Hamas, like Israel just left Hamas there until October 7th, and then, had to be destroyed or whatever. And, I mean, there's just so much mythology on the left. There's so much ideology, and there's so much psychology involved, that it's really hard to disentangle. Like there are so many layers. Like people are like, well, you can't defeat an insurrection. Like you can't, counterinsurgency never works. And it's like, actually 9 times out of 10, it does work.
Mm-hmm.
Like just this kind of Vietnam era type romantic, like leftist ideology.
Yeah, and total misreading of Vietnam too. I mean,
total.
Complete.
I mean, all sorts of levels. Like again, like how do you even begin to disentangle this? But I just thought, okay, so people hear Hamas is terrorism, and Marxists have always been against terrorism, and they certainly were always against this kind of terrorism. They were against the kind of terrorism like dude Luigi Mangione did.
Yeah, Luigi Mangione. Oh my God.
Which is
yeah.
far less egregious than October 7th.
Well,
but it's still egregious.
You did a digression. Let me do a very brief digression. This is something I picked up from America This Week with Kern and Taibbi yesterday, and in my fever dreams, because I was getting over the flu. Luigi Mangione is now a fashion plate. He appeared in court. Let's see, what does it say in Women's Wear Daily? They report on Luigi Mangione's latest brands deals, maybe. So he attended court wearing a white collared shirt, a burgundy sweater, and orange sneakers. The brands associated with him were Nordstrom and Maison Margiela, which is a high-end fashion
oh my goodness
brand. So at first, videos on TikTok identified Mangione's crew neck top as Maison Margiela's burgundy washed lamb's wool sweater, which was available for sale at $1,000. The piece is now
he's a rich bastard.
Yeah.
No, he's a rich bastard. I mean, let me say this about this. So Mangione...
it's not just that he's a rich bastard.
No.
But Kern's fantasy here, and I think it may be true, is that his attorney is like getting off the phone with these different. It's like they're offering us this amount to wear if you wear this.
Yeah.
Nordstrom wants you to wear their shoes.
Right. It's like why not wear a nondescript suit? Well, because they decided that won't work to get the popular sympathy. And I think that, dude...
Also because there's brand deal money on the table for Luigi if he wears the right shoes in court. That's what... No, I mean, I can't verify that.
No. I mean, I don't think that you're allowed to profit from your crimes. It would go into the victim's restitution fund. Any money that the criminal makes.
Or maybe, your attorney would get a cut.
Well, I mean, there's corruption. I'm not going to rule out corruption.
Right.
But like Daniel Penny, right?
Mm-hmm.
Wore a very smart suit in court. And I think it was to garner sympathy rather than a nondescript suit.
Right.
He wore a very fashion forward fitting, trim, tailored suit. Looked good. And I mean, obviously these are young men. They're going to look decent. It doesn't take much. You just scrub them up. They're going to look good. So, but again, like, why does the left like Luigi Mangione? Because they think of him as like a romantic terrorist of the kind that the Marxists condemned back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
Except not even. He's not even, right? In other words, like the anarchists of the late 19th and early 20th century did see themselves as socialists in a way that Mangione is just a very disgruntled liberal, like a kind of progressive,
I guess. I mean, we really don't know what is actually going on with any of this. All I know is that
based on reporting so far, which may or may not be true, but based on appearances, let's put it that way, it would appear that he's your typical rad lib.
Right.
And that's what we're really dealing with, by the way. So we're not dealing with actual anarchism, and we're not dealing with, like Stalinism. Like the Stalinism we're dealing with now is really just rad libism, which I'm sure will upset Haas and others and Daniel Tutt and whatever. But they are just that. And, this is really a post-60s phenomenon, meaning things have become quite degraded, ideologically. And the relationship between, it's why we called like the Palestinian solidarity protests rad lib. Which again is going to like really because no, they're not liberal, right? It's like, but they're not socialists, and then it's like, oh well, you're some kind of purist Marxist, and it's like, wait, do you know what I mean? Like you can't have it both ways, right? You can't like defend rad libism against purist Marxism and deny that it's rad libism,
right?
So. And this is just, again, to sort of try to bring it down to earth and demystify. But again, like, it's like Luigi Mangione. Is he like the avatar of some collective subject that's just there, that's just imputed? He just struck a blow on the part of the workers of the world.
I don't think so.
Right.
But
In other words, you can only claim that by, in a sense, reifying and ideologizing social reality. And that's what people do with Hamas, right? They just say, well, PLO sold out, and so Hamas takes their place, and it doesn't matter that they're Islamists, they're just the national liberation movement du jour. And if you get rid of Hamas, then Islamic Jihad will be the Palestinian National Liberation Movement du jour. I'm sure that PFLP will be happy to have a coalition with Islamic Jihad instead of Hamas. Right. And so we're left with the same problem, which is that the left is tailing and propping up ideologically capitalist political phenomena. And, you know, historical anarchism, the anarchism of the propaganda of the deed, was contemporaneous with a developed proletarian socialist movement. They both existed at the same time. Bakunin and LaSalle existed at the same time. Right. And so it's hard to separate. Like, it's true that Marxism dominated the socialist or communist movement before World War I, but anarchism was still there. It was a minority tendency, but it was also a real tendency in a way that it's not today. So, I think of Adorno when he says the return of anarchism is that of a ghost. Meaning, if anarchism was a kind of discontent with a kind of Second International Marxism that the anarchists considered to be reformist. So it's interesting to note, so do the Stalinists. Meaning the Stalinists tend to agree with the anarchists. And then lo and behold, they come up with rationales for this propaganda of the deed type action, whether on the individual scale or on the scale of Hamas. Right? And, I just think, well, I think you were talking with Derek Varn about this in the video you released this week, which is that these problems are very old. We have not overcome them, but we are dealing with them in a degraded form, in an extremely degraded form. And so the first step, and this has been the entire point of platypus pedagogy from the get-go, is to recognize the historical roots for the apparently new phenomena.
Right.
And it is a repetition, and it is a regression. And we have not overcome these things. And there's a reason why we're still talking about Marxism, this relic of the 19th century.
Well, you said something that I wanted to pick up on and see if I could also get back to the question of dialectics that emerged for me as I read your book. So you said that the left has tended to tail after one symptom or whatever forces are emerging from capitalism and capitalist politics. The left tails after this and that faction or symptom. And my question is, how do we aim at sublating capitalism, that is, realizing the full potential of capitalist society and thereby overcoming it without tailing one or another symptom or emergent power from the capitalist system? And I'll be specific and say, for myself, I have tended to be, Varn mentioned this, and I got into trouble in various ways after Trump was elected when I said that I thought the election of Trump was ultimately for the best. I was ambivalent about it, but
we have to make it for the best.
It was a better outcome. Right? And
we have to make the best of it.
What made me really feel confirmed in that was when he selected RFK for Health and Human Services, when he selected this guy Jay Bhattacharya for the NIH, and when he got Kash Patel to be the
Kash Patel for FBI and Tulsi Gabbard for DNI.
Tulsi Gabbard.
Great.
Right. And I'm just like, okay, so there is going to be some perhaps very dramatic reckoning and house cleaning.
Yep.
That's
really
going to come through this administration. And we should be aware of that, and people on the left, socialists, should be supportive of that in some way or another.
Christian Parenti wrote an article for Compact.
Mm-hmm.
It's called "The Left Case for Kash Patel."
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah,
and it's good. I mean, basically says you don't want to be left in the position of defending the FBI.
Right. But as I embrace that aspect of it, there are many things that the Trump administration is apparently planning on doing. For instance, getting rid of the 14th Amendment, or
Okay, so can I just sidebar on that one? All right.
Yeah.
So obviously they can't get rid of the 14th Amendment. However,
Right.
The 14th Amendment was not always interpreted to give immigrants birthright citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's very possible that the Supreme Court will say, actually, it's not in the 14th Amendment. It was never.
When was it not interpreted that way?
For the first several decades.
Okay.
There was a case where it was decided that it does apply. And that's in the late 19th or early 20th century. In other words, it's very opportunistic. So immigration was not an issue in 1865, the way it became at the turn of the 20th century.
Right.
And so they just interpreted it accordingly.
Mm-hmm.
And now it is again. So therefore, right, they might decide, well, actually it doesn't.
Right, but okay, so maybe I'm overstating the case by saying he's going to get rid of the 14th
because
Amendment.
Because it's the under U.S. jurisdiction,
Hmm.
right? So what that means is that a diplomat's child born overseas is an American citizen. A U.S. diplomat,
right,
born overseas is an American citizen. But then the question is, if someone is illegally in the United States and are still citizens of another country, is that child still under the jurisdiction of the home country? Yes, they are.
Yes, they are.
They are, right?
Yeah.
So that's that, right? And so it's a very straightforward Supreme Court argument to reinterpret the 14th Amendment and get rid of birthright citizenship. All that has to do is make the case, and the Supreme Court agrees, and that's that.
Wait. If the child is born in the United States and their parents are there illegally, is the child under U.S. jurisdiction? They are. Therefore,
they're minors, meaning they're under the legal control of their parents, who are citizens of another country. Meaning that child is a citizen of the other country. It's the whole dual citizenship thing.
Really? Are you telling me that a child born in the United States, parents who are not
tourists,
U.S. citizens,
are tourists? Of course, their home country is going to recognize their child as that home country's citizen. Of course, they are.
Yeah. Right.
Come on.
Yeah.
It's just that. In other words, I mean, I'm not saying this should happen. Again, it's not Hasbara propaganda.
Yeah.
I'm not saying this is a good thing. What I'm saying is it can happen, and we should be prepared for it to happen. We shouldn't be like shocked. Oh my God. Oh, he's violating the Constitution. No. This is all completely within the Constitution.
Well, okay. Yeah, but
because the Democrats are going to say, oh, see, fascism, violating the Constitution. No. That's not.
I would just think that a child, you've got parents that escape to the United States.
I know people whose parents came to the U.S. to give birth just so that the child would be a U.S. citizen. And then they took the child back and raised them there.
Okay.
No, I know people, more than one person.
I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying
is that gaming the system? In other words, why do Trump voters vote for Trump on immigration? Not because they're against immigration.
Because they want to limit the number of people who are getting the benefits.
No, that's not the reason. No. This is the big lie, Doug. This is the big lie.
Well, you didn't let me finish the sentence, so you don't know. Okay. The number of people who are getting the benefits of U.S. citizenship, or even if they're not citizens, competing with them in the job market.
I mean, they don't like that, but I think at a basic level, like nobody's sitting there thinking, like some people are, but generally speaking, they don't like people gaming the system. They think it's unfair. They think doing something like that, like just coming to the US to give birth in the US so that your child can be a citizen, so that that child can claim their citizenship later and then bring their parents over in retirement, because that happens a lot. A lot. They just think that's gaming the system. That's not fair. That's not the spirit of the law.
Right, but the spirit of what I was going to point to is the idea of a family escaping to the United States from circumstances, which I think is more, the prevalent case.
Are not the poor people. They're not the poor people. They're not. They have means to get here. These are middle class. The point of the matter is the U.S. is sucking up. It's a brain drain. It's sucking up the middle class of the rest of the world. The rest of the world is collapsing completely. The third world.
Wait a minute. What happened to? They're not sending their best. They're not sending their best.
Guess what?
Criminals.
Guess what? Criminals are middle class.
Yeah, I know, but
gangs are middle class.
Yeah.
Of course they are. They're capitalists. They're entrepreneurs. Right? Okay. They are sending their best, but they're not sending their best. Meaning,
regardless of what their class background here is, that my point is that I think the majority of people
them to be too cutthroat. We do want them to be cutthroat engineers, but not literally. Right? Entrepreneurs. Did I say engineers?
Yeah.
I was thinking about the whole stupid H-1B visa thing.
Yeah.
That is the tempest in a teapot. Right? Of Musk and Ramaswamy and the MAGA people who are like, the Indians are taking over. Right? Like Kash Patel and Vivek Ramaswamy, and that's the Indians are taking over. What about the white people? We will not be replaced. No, it's a big mess. And I just think nobody voted for this Laura Loomer type shit. Like, nobody voted for this.
No, I totally agree. But what I was trying to say was that the narrative I have in my mind is that people come from, say, Mexico to the United States because the conditions that they're in Mexico are less than ideal. They're willing to make a very arduous journey to try to escape to the United States to find a better life there. They're not tourists who are.
My mother was a nurse, and she worked at the county hospital. And she worked in neonatal ICU. And she anecdotally, but over the course of working decades, observed many people coming from around the world just to give birth in the United States.
I'm not saying it doesn't happen.
And these are middle class people. These are not poor people.
I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but I'm just trying to.
Happens. And
I'm just trying to say that there's a possibility.
My mother is not anti-immigrant, but she thinks that's unfair.
Well, I don't disagree that is. I do agree that
it is unfair. I don't care, actually.
Well,
I really don't care. Game the system. Everybody should game the system as much as possible.
Well, that's always been my attitude.
If
you're in a system,
welfare queens, I do not care.
Don't cheat the system, but game it. That's fine. That's not
there, though, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. but I'm just saying my understanding, and maybe I'm wrong. I'll look into it. But is that the majority of the people who end up naturalized by being born here of immigrant parents are not these, carpetbaggers or
Oh, that's the South speaking. That's the Southern heritage speaking there, because I'm for the carpetbaggers.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
Right.
Yeah, they're not just stopping in to cheat the system and fly back to Greece Nigeria. Or wherever. Or Nigeria, but rather that they are trying to restart their lives in the United States for the most part. I
mean, I think, again, I just don't care. Like, in other words, the people that I know who are this are middle class, and and it is about all sorts of things. It's about the parents wanting to give their children an opportunity to claim American citizenship if they want. And it's about all sorts of things, keeping their own options open as parents, to maybe retire to the United States, to be brought over by their children, right? I think it's all fine, right? And so, look, the Trumpism demagogues it. And Trump is suffering the effects of his own demagogy now with this whole H-1B visa thing, right? And, I mean, both parties demagogue it, I mean, generally speaking, look, the Democrats are right about immigration, which is that the U.S. depends on immigration of all levels. It depends on rich people immigrating, middle-class people immigrating, poor people immigrating. It depends on cheap labor. It depends on foreign cash coming into the U.S., buying property, establishing businesses, right? Because, there's a fast track to citizenship if you have the money. You know that.
Oh, yeah.
Literally,
yeah.
Right? And, the Democrats are like, yeah, what are you even talking about? We have to have immigration. And who cares whether it's legal, illegal, no person is illegal. And it's like, of course the Democrats are right about that. But what they've done in the last 4 years, if that wasn't asking for a backlash, I mean, that the immigration is proportionally exceeded the highest levels of Ellis Island immigration.
Right.
Far exceeded. And it has not been that. It's been this refugee status bogus bullshit. Meaning people don't like people gaming the system. People don't like the government gaming the system.
Right. Which is...
Come on, right?
Which is actually not just a sentiment that I can agree with, but I agree with that politically.
Principally, yeah, politically, exactly.
Yeah,
it's a political issue in a way that an individual person is not. What they're doing is not political. What the government is doing and what politicians are doing to justify it is political.
Sending in Haitians to Ohio in order to staff Amazon warehouses is a political act.
Political.
Which should be opposed. Not the Haitians.
Well, it's a policy. I don't even know if it should be opposed, but it should be clearly stated as such. In other words, the whole way. So if Trump lies about the negatives of immigration, what the Democrats have been doing is simply denying what they're doing.
Right.
Which is just crazy. It's like
I would think that Amazon warehouses should be made to pay living wages to Americans.
Sure.
That's what I think.
And yet the U.S. economy does depend on black market illegal labor. It does depend on, indeed, slave labor. It depends on these things, Doug. I mean, I don't know. Like, I watch Fox News, and like so many tens of thousands of children have gone missing in this whole immigration wave. And lo and behold, they've shown up in work sites doing slave child labor throughout the country. Well, guess what? It's not like the politicians don't know. They know. They don't care, because that's what happened in the early 20th century too. And so the point of the matter is that the illegal economy is a core part of capitalism. And both parties represent it. Both parties demagogue it. They demagogue it differently. So do you recall, like, the Obama administration? They did these, international trade deals, and they put provisos in them that said the details of this cannot be divulged to the public. Why did they do that? Because they're just like, we don't want this demagogued. Meaning, we don't want to have to answer the public on this. This is a gentleman's agreement between sovereign states and the public. Just, we know what's in their best interest. And, there's actually a rationale to that. Like, there's a point to that. There really is. Like, I am not unsympathetic to the technocrats who are like, look, we got this. Don't question us. We got this. But that's just not an occasional thing. That's normal operating procedure. And for a long time. And so when they accuse Trump of breaking norms, what they mean is he's putting things in the public that we're not supposed to talk about.
Right.
That's what they're accusing him of. They're saying, what? Wait a second. We've been doing this for decades, and we agreed it's not good to talk about it. And you're going and talking about it.
Right. Which is why you have to side with Trump on this point, on that basis.
Well, by the way, socialists are going to do the same thing. In other words, we've talked about the muckraking journalism. It's the same thing, which is they will suppress it because they're like, no good can come of this. This is a source of public disorder to publicize these things.
The socialists will do the muckraking journalism, and the state will try to suppress it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because it will be like, and it will be just like very gangsterish. It will just be like, don't speak of the Yakuza if you don't want to get killed. It's like that. Except it's the politicians, it's the state. But it's the same logic.
Right. Okay. So when we're talking about realizing capitalism and thereby overcoming it, are we talking about trying to, for instance, get rid of the illegal, corrupt aspects of capitalist society
eventually,
and insist upon?
Eventually, but not up front, because how can we? And I mean, look.
Well, we can do it by muckraking. We can do it simply by exposing.
Daylight is the best disinfectant. There is that idea, but again, that is not done for its own sake, meaning the capitalists will see it as an underhanded tactic, which it is. It's meant to.
How is it it's completely, it's not underhanded.
It's meant to be subversive. It is. There are NGOs, there are civil social organizations that keep their mouths shut, like the churches. The churches work the border. The churches are engaged with dealing with illegal immigrants. And they don't go publicizing it because it's a modus vivendi, meaning they're not going to talk about the corruption of the border police and other politicians. And the border police and the other politicians are going to turn a blind eye to the way that the churches are helping illegal immigrants.
Right.
Right? And they basically have a deal. The deal is, we won't talk about it, and we won't pretend, we won't talk about it, and we'll pretend not to notice that you're aiding and abetting crime or whatever, like whatever it is, right? And I think that this is going to be, it's a challenge because what I was going to say is, did you see the Hoffa movie?
No, I didn't see that.
Okay, so, Jimmy Hoffa, right? Mm-hmm. Teamsters, like labor militant, came up in the 30s, right? Was like, new communists, right? Was a class struggle kind of guy, but a mafia. Total, right?
Right.
How do you separate those things? You can't quite. Now, this is, again, where the anarchists are a little bit ahead of us.
Mm-hmm.
As, like, buttoned up, respectable socialists. The anarchists are like, crime? What crime? Do you remember Crime Think?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's like, on the one hand, it's like, oh, no, we don't want to go in for lumpenism, blah, blah, blah. On another level, it's like, of course, they're completely right about that. They're completely right about that. It's crazy, right? Because that's like, I'm drawing you back to your old anarchism after you became a buttoned up, respectable Marxist.
Well, look, here's my problem is that for Sublation, I want to try to introduce, some kind of investigative journalism where we will expose realities that are left unsaid most of the time at Sublation. And I think we can do it.
I think we can do it. Our purpose is not to subvert. It's not to call out. It's not like the left version of Project Veritas or something. It's actually to encourage and help inform activism, organizing. In other words, if we understand that that's the point, look, I am sympathetic to, but I also am not very sympathetic to Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, whatever. I think that their rights have been violated. I do think just let them off, fine. But I also think the state is like, nothing good can come of this. WikiLeaks, just exposing, whatever. It's bad, right? and you are aiding and abetting the enemy. You are undermining the military effort. Blah. So now
not with Edward Snowden. I mean, Edward Snowden was
Snowden. Yeah, it's more Snowden, and you know,
Snowden it's Assange who was undermining the U.S. military effort, and it was Snowden who was undermining the NSA's surveillance of almost all of American.
Oh yeah, like wiretapping Angela Merkel. So no, but
but just like they basically are keeping all the records on everybody, the emails, phone calls, all of it.
I defend
recording it, and then and then anytime they decide that that you're worth investigating, they can pull it up. They have full documentation.
They have compromat on everyone.
Yeah.
The U.S.
On everyone. And that's that's a violation of your constitutional rights. That's just straight up, you're being surveilled.
You know what it is, Doug? It's interesting because it comes down to what's admissible in court. And that's why, like, do you know that Kash Patel, like, he doesn't want to get rid of the FISA court. But
he wants to reform it.
Yes. And his version of that is to make sure that there is the strongest amount of advocacy against whatever the government is demanding before the FISA court. Mm-hmm. And that might be the best that you can do. You may not be able to.
Okay. I mean, as a good liberal, I'm okay with that answer. Great. But you can't tell me that Edward Snowden didn't help create the conditions for Kash Patel. And,
Oh, yeah. No, I know. I'm not saying, look, again, it's not for or against. I defend Assange and Snowden. Mm-hmm. However, I don't think that, like, their tactics, their means, their ends, like how they understood what they were doing and the purpose by which they're doing it, I think are inadequate, insufficient, and are potentially misleading, and therefore can't be taken as a model. In other words, like, you can defend these things without saying, okay, and that's what socialists need to do, because the purposes are different. And, we're getting very fine-grained here. It's like, again, muckraking journalism is all well and good in and of itself. And all muckraking journalists should be defended against the state. Mm-hmm. However, the reason that proletarian socialists might do it would be different than the reason liberals would do it.
Right.
Purpose is different. So
it's not to impugn the other party.
Right. It's not like naming and shaming, the capitalists or politicians or bureaucrats. It's not for that. In other words, it's rather to show, like, the point, like, again, activist journalism would be to show that working class people can do for themselves even under very adverse conditions.
Right.
So meaning that all the crooks can remain nameless. Because the point is to show what the workers can do for themselves.
Yeah.
That's really the point. The point is to encourage. The point is not to...
Yeah, but that sounds a little bit too much like propaganda to me, Chris.
But but of course it is propaganda, Doug. We can't be afraid of that. Of course it's propaganda. Of course. But again, if we have an adequate, or at least try to have an adequate self-understanding of what we're doing and, the ultimate goal and the means of getting there along the way, then propaganda doesn't have to be a dirty word. Meaning, like, obviously we have horrible examples of propaganda in the worst sense of just mere boosterism, or kind of like a leftist ideology celebrating, I mean, look, when I go back,
I don't want to celebrate defeats as victories. I
certainly don't want to do that. No, of course not. But if you look back to the old Socialist Party of America, and you look at their, like, press, it does kind of give you a little bit of, like, the heebie-jeebies. It is like 30s Stalinism. It is. And yet it isn't. Because you know that behind it is not some apologia for a bureaucratic slave state. Right. In other words, it hadn't lost its innocence yet. Meaning it creeps one out because it reminds one of all this Orwellian crap. And yet it wasn't that. Not yet.
Right.
It became that.
Right. So
it isn't that just to start with. And we do have to reinvent it. In other words, we have to find our own rhetoric, our own imagery. We can't just do this LARPing, recycled. right? We really, there's no blueprint.
Yeah. When I was at the student newspaper back when I was in college, I dug up the original mission statement for the Portland State University Vanguard, which was the name of the paper I was working on. And and it was, by the way, thought to be the more middle of the road, like conformist, like reformist kind of paper. Like it was
Centrist.
the main paper. Yeah, the centrist one. And then there was the student insurgent or something like that. The rear guard was the radical one for some reason. And but I dug up
barricades.
Yeah, right. I dug up the original mission statement, and it was basically to be ruthlessly critical of the powerful and to in the interests of the powerless. That was the aim. Not, and I thought that was good enough that I would,
speaking truth to power. It's a good bourgeois ethic.
No, it's not speaking truth to power. No, being ruthlessly critical of the powerful and being a thorn in the side of the powerful.
Oh, so more than that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but whereas you would not investigate a single worker's life and find all the muck on. You wouldn't do muckraking on the powerless, right? You wouldn't go after the people who were, not.
Well, again, the muck is the adversity that people are trying to lift themselves out of. In other words, it's not just the misery.
No, well, I think of the muck as the corruption. And,
there's that. Yeah, there's that. Right. But again, the corruption only matters because it's an adverse condition for the people.
Right.
It's not meaning who cares how much money has to grease the wheels? Who cares? Ultimately, who cares? Except it's bound up with conditions that are adverse to the struggle for socialism.
Right.
But other than that, do I care if Maxine Waters is a multimillionaire as a result of being in Congress? I don't care. Do I care about Nancy Pelosi being an inside trader, stock market beneficiary? I don't.
I do, but only in so much as it might influence her decisions as a policymaker.
See, from her perspective, it gives her the financial independence to be able to stand on principle, and she's probably right about that. You know what I mean? It's like, fuck. I mean, something that my husband Fazell is always like impressed by is how they got rid of the 2 Republican senators from Georgia on the flimsiest pretexts of insider information, whereas people like Maxine Waters and Nancy Pelosi just like do it with impunity, right? And so he's just like, they just get rid of the Republicans instantly as soon as they discover any conflict of interest, whereas the Democrats just have no problem with it, and I was just like, yeah, that's power, and that's really the issue. The issue is it's always going to be selectively attacked or prosecuted,
right? But I would think that an article about that would fit into
a socialist movement only insofar as the person makes themselves the dead set enemy. Like that would be good against Joseph McCarthy or something. Do you know what I mean? But otherwise, the socialists might have to, again, swimming with sharks, meaning that they're sharks. The capitalist politicians are corrupt. They are sharks. They are. And
I started out with this theoretical aim, right? But we are now talking about what I was wanting to talk about, but in a very concrete, real world way. And so my theoretical uneasiness, that in the abstract I was uneasy, is now being made. I'm being made uneasy. Maybe this is my radlibism. I'm not sure.
It might be your radlibism or just your plain liberalism. It might be not in a negative sense by any means.
Yeah, it's my plain liberalism, not my radlibism. Yeah,
right. To do this, like again, how do you deal with reality without becoming cynical?
Right, because I've been thinking you sounded cynical and a lot of
but I'm not being cynical. I'm just being realistic, and it's kind of like you're gonna have a modus vivendi with crooks of all kinds.
Yeah.
Official and unofficial crooks, legal crooks, illegal crooks. Right? Like workers are going to have a modus vivendi with their employers who are shafting them. They're going to have a modus vivendi with the cops who are horrible, and with the politicians who are venal. They're just going to have to. And with the gangs, again, like world that one enters in civil social organizing is immediately the world of organized crime. It's immediately the world of organized crime. There's never been any labor union organizing that has been free of dealing with organized crime. And what that means is, again, you have to be able to ecologically cohabitate with the predators.
Right.
And as soon as we have any power, we're going to be seen as competing predators. Right? And so navigating that, it requires a great deal of deftness. It's going to be, I don't think that it's very complicated, actually, as long as we keep our purposes clear. Meaning, like, labor unionism. Well, guess what? For a socialist, labor unions are not an end in themselves. If you treat them as an end in themselves, they become gangs, they become rackets. They're not ends in themselves. They're only good insofar as they help the struggle for socialism. If you keep that in mind, it helps. Right? And I think that's the other problem that we have with the conflation of theory and propaganda, is that we forget the purpose of the propaganda. In other words, we read the propaganda articulation from the historical left, and we're just like, oh, this is what they stand for. This is their principle. And it's like, no, this is the way they were propagandizing it. Right? It's not, this is not the core principle or the core self-understanding or the theory. It is not. Right? And so, again, it's like, I mean, it's why people get upset with the Frankfurt School, because the Frankfurt School are like, okay, we're going to talk. We're going to explain ourselves apart from any propagandistic needs whatsoever.
Yeah.
And then people are like, oh,
that is what I admire about the Frankfurt School.
But then they're traitors. Instantly, they're traitors. Right? Because if you just speak the truth, then guess what? You're a traitor. And, but it's like they understood that what allowed them to do that was that the struggle was over. Meaning they weren't betraying anyone because it was over. Did they care about betraying Stalin? They did not.
Right.
Because they're just like, look, these people, they're gangsters and they have power, and what we say isn't really going to hurt them. And so, there's just nothing to lose. And in the meantime, it's helpful for some people to know the truth.
Right. Well, I feel like we are also in that moment. We're still in that Frankfurt School moment, are we not?
Unfortunately, yeah. Unfortunately.
So,
we do have to speak with different voices in different contexts and for different purposes. We do.
Right. And the campaign for Socialist Party is, if there's going to be a journalism that comes out of it, it will have to accommodate itself to whatever deals are being struck on the
needs
ground.
of activism. Yeah, the needs of activism. But again, like, I'm always, I love the Kolakowski essay, The Concept of the Left. That's near and dear to me in terms of platypus. Meaning, the point is, one is going to have to make compromises, and then the issue is not pretending that they're not compromises.
All I would say is we start with with what you want to do, float it, test it out, talk to the people who might be
see what's
impacted,
possible.
and then and hear back from them before you decide ahead of time. Oh, that's no, right.
You can't say that. No, of course, exactly. And so it's the opposite. The platypus is closer to the Frankfurt School, which is that there's nothing to lose in speaking the truth.
Yeah, it's more fun than what we're talking about.
No, I mean, what we're talking about is, but again, it's for the purposes. Like, in other words, I was always clear the platypus, the purpose was intellectuals. And if intellectuals are lying to themselves, even though they have no power, there's no consequence whatsoever. There's no benefit for them lying to themselves. It's only to their detriment. Then they should not lie to themselves.
Well, there are some ways in which it is to your benefit to lie to yourself.
Well, sure. But in terms of, I mean, yeah, I guess.
You can get a nice, cushy academic job. You might head
lie
up
to yourself versus making a deliberate, self-conscious compromise. Like, it isn't better, like, if you're going to have to dissemble in some way, to do it knowingly rather than in a self-deceiving way.
Right. No, I agree. But we get trained to be self-deceiving.
Sure.
Because we're not meant to even have the kind of power that a dissembler would have.
This is what it means. The left is dead, meaning, like, people aren't even making compromises because there's nothing to compromise. Do you know? Like, it's you know, and so what people are doing instead is that they're being like progressive liberals and they're dressing it up with this phony Marxism. And then they're tailoring their phony Marxism to fit the politesse and PC nonsense. And so it's just so many levels of self-deception.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and then you get into this place of, like, I don't know, the dangerous thoughts, you know, like, oh, Nietzsche raises dangerous thoughts, you know, like Daniel Tutt says. And it's like, you know, actually there's a far more dangerous thoughts than you get from Nietzsche. There are far more creepier thinkers out there and far more dangerous thoughts. And we should allow ourselves those dangerous thoughts, because what are you going to do? You're going to repress them? You know, like, again, like, that kind of self-deception is just, you know, wrong. Meaning, like, yeah, admit, you know? So
don't be self-deceived, but don't operate on the principle that you can never lie.
Well, of course, it's not the case, right? So in practice, of course, one has to lie. I mean, in the realm that we're talking about, and again, there's lying and there's lying. Meaning, I'm sure people think that Platypus has lied. It is not. And I'm proud of it.
Well, I'm sure. Why would Platypus lie? Right.
There's no point. Exactly. There's absolutely no point. Like, just ask us. We'll tell you what we think, really. Because nothing to lose, really. And, you know, but, you know, like, a worker trying to organize...
Oh, it has to lie. You have to lie.
I mean, right? I mean, you know, but is that a lie? Like, what is that? That's not really a lie.
Are you organizing a union? No. You know, that's what you tell your employer. You don't say, yes, I am. You know? Listen, I'm going to... Let's end it here, and then we'll start another for the parrot room in just a minute.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.